everybody, it's Charles from HumbleMechanic.com. Today, I'm taking your questions on Touaregs, transmission swaps, check engine lights, and more. This is episode 178 of the Humble Mechanic Podcast. All right, if you would like to get a question on a show like this, email me, charles@humblemechanic.com. Put question for Charles in the subject, just like it says below. Ask your question right at the top, mash the enter button a few times, give me the details of your question. That really does help me out. Also, if you don't see your question on a show like this, be sure to check out the quick videos playlist on YouTube where I typically answer one question per video. All right, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is CRP Automotive. CRP deals in a ton of OE maintenance and repair parts, timing belt kits, suspension components, and even fluids. In fact, they make the factory DSG fluid for Volkswagen and Audi. So check them out at crpautomotive.com. All right, one more thing before we get into the show. This premium membership, the Crew Members, as I've been calling it, is finally ready to launch. January 31st is the official launch date, so make sure you put a big old circle on your calendar. The first 100 people that sign up are going to get extra bonuses in addition to all the really great stuff that being a crew member does get you. So I'll be talking more about that. I'll be doing a video on it, blog post, the whole thing. So sit tight, but remember guys, January 31, circle that date. All right, with all that finally wrapped up, let's get into the questions. First one comes from Peter. I've emailed you a few times. You saved me a ton of headache working on a Beetle. I own my own shop and I've got an 04 Touareg coming in this week and it needs front control arms. It has the 4.2 V8 and does not have air ride. I've looked at the procedure in all data and it looks pretty straightforward. Are there any big gotchas I need to look out for? I won't be doing the alignment. He's taking it to a specialty shop because I don't have an alignment rack. Peter, great question. This is a pretty straightforward job. So the great thing about all data is a lot of times, not all the time, a lot of times it walks you through step by step by step on how to do these jobs. The one thing I would say, you're dealing with a car that's now almost 13 years old, if not a touch older, because a lot of these 04s were actually built in 03. You want to make sure you're using some penetrating oil on the bolts. Depending on where you live, they can get really, really, really unhappy and be rusted and corroded in. Also, on lines of the bolts, you probably want to go ahead and replace them as well. Oftentimes, these suspension bolts are torqued to yield. That means as you tighten them, they actually stretch out just a little bit. You want to make sure that you get good ones in. Also, really want to pay attention to the torque sequence, or more like the torque strategy is probably a better way to say it. What I mean is you want to look at the way you need to torque the bolts. Some of the bolts in the suspension are torqued with the car up in the air. Some of them are torqued with the car on the ground, and it's very important because the suspension gets loaded or unloaded differently, whether it's up in the air or down on the ground. So pay really close attention to that. Again, replace the bolts, but man, this is a pretty straightforward job. You don't have to worry about doing the alignment, which is a good thing for you since you don't have a rack. Take a good look at the rest of the suspension though and make sure none of the other bushings or ball joints or anything like that are worn out. That you'll also want to replace as well. Otherwise, it'll make doing the alignment not impossible really, but kind of a waste of time because it'll be a dynamically changing alignment as the customer's driving down the road. So don't be scared of working on 04 Touaregs, guys. They're not as hard as people make them out to be. Sure, there's some tricky stuff, some difficult stuff, but especially, Peter, with what you're doing, it's all nuts and bolts. All right, next one comes from Taylor. I've looked everywhere for an answer to this question and I have had no luck. I know people are doing manual transmission conversions on cars for years, but is it possible to do a conversion to cars that no longer offer a manual transmission package? For example, 2016 models, as most people I've seen use donor transmissions from a manual version of the same car. So Taylor, my advice whenever someone asks me, is it possible to? The answer is yes. Of course it's possible. It depends on how much money you want to spend. You're right. Most people, when they do manual trans swaps, they either get the transmission and all the parts from a car of that same vintage that had a manual transmission, or they buy it new. For the rich folks, they buy the new ones. Most people, though, you're right, do use a donor car. So what do you do if the car you want to swap a manual transmission into never had a manual transmission? Well, look around, right? Shop the car. So let's take a Golf, for example, and you want to do a Golf with a manual transmission. on, I don't know, a CCTA. I know it came with a manual transmission, but let's pretend that, here's a better one. Let's pretend you want to do a transmission swap in a 2008 R32, which didn't come with a manual transmission. So your first thing you're going to want to do is, like he did, is look for other cars that had the same engine and had a manual transmission. If that doesn't go well, now we have to start looking at other similar cars that have a manual transmission. So for that example, maybe we go to the Audi side and look at an A3 and see if there's an A3 that had a manual transmission that we could look at. We also want to look at, worst case, we look at maybe just doing a whole powertrain swap. So if you were swapping from a manual transmission to a 2-point slow in a newer Jetta, maybe instead of doing just the engine or just a transmission, maybe we look at doing the whole engine and transmission package. That's another route to go. Personally, that's what I would do, but there's multiple options that we have here. If that doesn't work, the worst or most extreme case you're probably looking at, without going a full-blown custom system, is to maybe look at an adapter plate to mount the manual transmission to the engine. And if you have to go that route, a lot of times you also have to do custom length axles, perhaps custom engine mounts. It can get really deep really, really quick. So I guess what I would probably do is define the car that I have, obviously, try and find some car, whether it's the year different or like VW to Audi or something like that, Honda to Acura, try and find that same family to get the transmission out of. If that doesn't work, look overseas, because it may be cheaper to, let's say, buy a Canadian transmission, which I know isn't overseas, but it may be cheaper to buy a Canadian transmission, have it shipped here, bolt it right up, than it would be to retrofit some transmission that, the car never had. So look in the rest of the world and see if that car ever did come with a manual transmission, and try and explore that route, because that, again, might actually be not a cheap route or an inexpensive route, but it may be more affordable while retaining the factory fit, finish, feel, engine mounts, axle links of your vehicle. Other than that, guys, this is a great question for the audience. What do you think is another really good way to bolt a manual trans up and install it in a car that never came with that option? All right, next one comes from Walt. I didn't think I'd be asking you another question so soon. I have 2 Audis and the oil pressure light shut off engine came on as soon as I was pulling into the driveway. I've had no issues. The MMI, which is the display in the cluster, oil level shows full. Changed the oil a month ago with a man filter, liquid moly. Limited info on AutoZine. I'll be going to the dealership today to get an oil pressure sensor. I understand it's just below the oil filter. Do you have a link that talks about replacement, or is it pretty straightforward? Thanks, Walt. So Walt, I'm sorry because I forget what kind of engine you had on your Audi. If it's one of the new 2 liters, newer 1.8s, they are super easy. It is directly below the oil filter. You just loosen it and put the new one on, tighten it. Don't tighten it too tight, of course, because it's going to be into aluminum. Pretty easy to strip out. Here's my thing though, when it comes to oil warning lights, it's almost never the switch that fails. It happens. It happened, I've seen a couple of them fail over the years, but almost every single time, it's actually due to an oil problem. You mentioned you changed your oil. If this is a 2-liter turbo, especially an older one like the CCTA or CBFA in a Volkswagen, there is a little sleeve that when you spin the filter off, oftentimes pops out. It will actually cause this exact problem. So with a car cold, you can take that oil filter off and see if the fitting is in there. And if it's not, well, try and find it, or see if maybe you can get one from the Audi store. Or a Volkswagen store may have it too, again, depending on what car you have. Another super annoying thing about a ton of newer cars is they don't have a dipstick. I think it's dumb that they don't have a transmission level dipstick, right? But it's really awful that cars do not have an engine oil dipstick. I get it, like it's cheaper and maybe you don't want people that aren't qualified checking the oil level. But this one is absolutely stupid to me. So what I would do if I owned a vehicle that did not have a dipstick, I would go and I would buy a dipstick, whether it's a dipstick for the car, because a lot of these you can get a dipstick for, or whether it was a universal dipstick. Now, a universal dipstick a lot of times is a little bit more expensive, but what you do is you put it in the oil fill tube, or not the oil fill tube, but the oil dipstick tube, because hopefully it still has the tube. And you actually mark off where the dipstick would land and then pull it out and check the oil level. This may take a little bit of practice. You also need to be 100% sure that your oil level is correct. They're about 50 bucks on Amazon. I'll throw a link down in the description if you want to check one out. But if it were me, that's what I would do. I'd make sure I had a dipstick, because if the switch is bad, the oil pressure switch is bad, at least you know you have good oil level. And I really feel more comfortable by going, yep, my oil's good, rather than having to wait for the computer to monitor the level and tell me whether it's good or not. Some people agree with that, some people don't. This is just my opinion. If I were going to own a vehicle without a dipstick, that's exactly what I would do. I'd either get the one for the car or the universal one. So, well, I hope that helps you out. Consider buying a dipstick for your car. Again, the universal one or the one for the vehicle, like the Touaregs, for example, you can actually buy the dipstick for the car. So hope that helps, man. Again, if it's the 2-liter, yeah, it's super easy right on the side. Other engines, I don't know, they could be anywhere. Some are awful to get to. Others are pretty easy. The newest gen is super easy. So I hope that's what you got, and I hope that helps. The other good thing though about oil pressure switches is they're generally pretty cheap, under 20 bucks. So if it doesn't fix it, you really haven't wasted a bunch by putting a new one on. Also, look at the wiring. There's a connection on Volkswagens anyway, on the A cars, the Mark 4, 5, 6 cars, probably not the Mark 4, but the Mark 5 and 6 cars. There's a 14-pin connector just behind the driver's headlight that I've seen have issues. So you might want to see if you have that same connection junction as well. But man, I hope that helps, and let's get that oil light straightened out. All right, time for one more. This one's from John. My girlfriend has a 2006 Passat 2.0 with 56K. She got a check engine light, and the code reader showed a P2015, a P2008, and a P2181. I saw your intake replacement video on Shop DAP, and I was all set to call the dealership to order the manifold and the thermostat to tackle the job. But she took it to her local mechanic who addressed the P2181, which is malfunctioning cooling system. Generally, the thermostat does fix that. Tackled that by changing the thermostat, and addressed the intake faults by changing the oil before clearing the codes. In parentheses, I kid you not. The car now shows a P2038 turbo/super boost sensor A circuit high input. The P2115 and 2008 codes are absent. The car barely accelerates to 25 miles per hour, and then it does better. My suspicion is that either the intake tube is loose or damaged, as you mentioned, having seen in your video, or that the boost sensor connector is loose, given the aforementioned shop would have had to remove the tube to replace the thermostat. I'm taking a wild guess that this is somehow preventing the 2015 and the 2008, and that the defective intake still needs to be addressed along with whatever is causing the 2038. Does this sound reasonable to you? John, that's a lot of words, but great information. Thank you for that. So, John, here is what I think has happened. I bet you he just didn't plug in that sensor. There is a sensor on the intake pipe that runs across the front of the engine that a lot of guys will take off to do the thermostat. You don't have to, but it does make it quite a bit easier. First thing you need to do, grab your flashlight and look down under the hood and make sure you don't have a connector unplugged. Make sure that the intake boot is all the way on. Make sure that it's not cracked or broken or anything stupid like that. I've seen all of those things happen. I've seen it done by professionals, and I've seen it done by, well, people that call themselves professionals. So first thing, get your eyes on it. Make sure nothing is obvious. After that, dude, I hesitate to even say this, but I would probably take it back to that last guy that worked on it, because changing the oil doesn't take care of intake manifold runner faults. and it wasn't there before and it is now, so you probably want to give him the opportunity to fix it. Again, it could be something really simple. You have a static fault or an open circuit fault. My guess is that it's probably just unplugged, or you may just need to go click and plug it in all the way. As far as, and this is really why I like this question, as far as one fault masking other faults, absolutely possible. It generally doesn't happen when it's an electrical fault. So an electrical fault, for example, would be a connector unplugged. These typically happen when it's monitoring faults. So if I have a really big problem on this side and a smaller problem on this side, this may never be detected because this other bigger, much more severe problem is going on. You said it really struggles under 25 miles per hour. Perhaps what we have going on isn't going to happen over 25 miles per hour. I'm not saying that in this specific case, but that's what we want to be thinking along the lines of, what does it take to create a fault, right? What is going on over here on this side versus what it takes to create the fault? The two may just not match up, but absolutely one fault can mask another problem and another problem and another problem. If you're walking through the woods and you come across a bridge that's out, you don't know whether there's another bridge out down the path until you get across that one. And unfortunately for technicians, sometimes that's how we have to approach diagnostics on a car. Customers generally don't like it, but we try and be as upfront with them. I should say that. I try and be as upfront with them as I possibly can, and I think the majority of my other fellow really good caring technicians are the same way. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to fix problem A before we ever realize there was a problem B. From a technician standpoint, this is why it's really important to QC your cars, check them, make sure that you actually fix something and you don't bring up another problem or reveal another problem, or like in this guy's case, you didn't maybe miss something, or maybe do something to the car or not do something to the car to cause another problem. All right, guys, I'm gonna wrap it up there. If you have any questions or comments, you know what to do. Hey, if you like this video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at humblemechanic.com. Don't forget, the premium membership is coming soon. Remember, the first 100 are gonna score a couple of really awesome exclusive Humble Mechanic pocket screwdrivers, as well as a ton of other giveaways that I'm gonna be doing. And then for everyone else, you are going to get amazing discounts, amazing content, a ton of free stuff as soon as I flip the switch on. So I'm really pumped about that. You guys can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on Snapchat. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.